Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday afternoon Zoom series. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis, and today we are most fortunate to host Jodie Evans, the co-founder of Code Pink. Jodie is a political activist, author, and documentary filmmaker. Her peace activism includes environmental causes, women's rights, and working for peace and justice. She has traveled extensively promoting conflict resolution by peaceful means, leading delegations of citizen diplomats to Iraq, the Gaza Strip, Cuba, Afghanistan, and I'm sure a list of other places that I don't even know about. She served in the cabinet of California Governor Jerry Brown in his first two terms and managed his 1992 campaign for the presidency. Jodie is the co-founder of the women's anti-war activist Code Pink and serves as board chair of Rainforest Action Network. And our program today will focus on her recent month-long experience in China and include comments about US-China relations. So welcome, Jodie. It's just smashing having you here with us today.
Thank you, Georgia. And you forgot to say that 23 years ago, we were in Croatia together on a peace conference.
Right. There's so many things to say about you. I don't know where to stop and where to start.
Us together.
But yes, Jodie and I helped plan a conference in Dubrovnik, Croatia in 2000. That's 23 years ago. And we went there in 1999, I think maybe a couple of times. And it was just after the war, so things were still pretty primitive. And but we had a fabulous time. And that was the beginning of Praxis, basically. It came out of that conference. So thank you, Jodie, for being there and being part of that. So yeah, we have a history. We were also both delegates for Jerry Brown in 1992 at the Democratic Convention in New York. So yeah, we've been through a few things together.
Right.
So I know you wanted to say a few things about your trip before I ask you any questions. So go ahead.
Well, really, I just like to put the whole thing in context before we talk about the trip. So this trip was part of a campaign we have at Code Pink called China is Not Our Enemy. And the reason I started this campaign was 3.5 years ago, I started really getting that there was hate being driven on China. And it felt very much like the drive up to the Iraq war. It was propaganda. It was full on hate. It didn't make sense. It was a lot of irrational words that were meant to trigger your empathy and your compassion to be against China. And so the goal of this campaign in the beginning was I was noticing that the propaganda was targeted on progressives, and they were going to try to use the progressives to be the vanguard for the war on China. Those are my friends. So we spent about a year educating all the progressive movement, progressive members of Congress about like the propaganda and how not to be used by it. And also to build a big tent of organizations that do not agree on politics necessarily, but do agree that China is not our enemy. And the last thing that anyone needs or wants is a US war on China. The other thing we really learned was to stay out of the weeds. The State Department and Pentagon, create these weeds to take you in and have you argue, and we stay out of them. Everything we do, we try to be educational against all the misinformation in the United States about China. And so if there's weeds, we don't get in them because they're not helpful. They're not, if the end result is there should be no war, we ask, why are those weeds necessary? And if they're not, we stay away from them. The other big concerning thing is that we found out that Robert Kagan, who's married to Haspel, who's the number 3 at the State Department, has tried to convince everyone in Washington that Washington, that the US military can win a nuclear war, which is a level of insanity I don't even want to discuss. But it's quite frightening that that is at the core of why the US thinks it can be at war with Russia and China, both nuclear powers. So, other things that we've taken on are, to raise up is in the streets of the United States. Most cities, there are people who are unhoused, and China was able to take everyone out of poverty. A US, Wall Street banker was super curious, like, how did China take everyone out of poverty? He hired an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker, took them to China, took a bunch of footage, came back, edited it, got PBS to be the producer, and that film has been censored by PBS. Why? Because it makes Beijing look too good. So we're also being denied the education because, it's just full on hate on China. And the first casualty of this US war on China are Asian Americans. The hate increase has been horrific, but also has been influential in getting people in Washington, D.C. to pull back, because they're really seeing that hate has an effect, and that effect is on the people of the US. It's also, this war on China, affecting all these islands that are surrounding China. The US has 250 bases circling China, and in the Mariana Islands and Guam and other islands, the devastation that has been caused to the human rights, to the pristine ecosystem, to the histories and cultures of these, like the Chamorro people in Guam and others around, is already a violence that we should not be signing up for. Then we've got NATO moving to China. NATO doesn't make sense in Asia. China has one base where the United States has 800 around the world, and that base is in Djibouti, because the US asked for China to build a base there to participate in their anti-piracy operations. So the propaganda is deep. And also, I would say we're in, a century of bad information about China. But let's just say the last 70 years have been really bad information about China. And also that we tend to read something about China and decide that that lasts for decades, instead of understanding that China changes so fast is kind of dizzying. And so one of the things we've been doing at Code Pink is going after this anti-China congressional committee, the first time ever in the history of the United States that there's a congressional committee taking on another country with hate. And it very much on the shoulders of the anti-communist McCarthy committee of the 50s. It's kind of frightening. And I went to the offices of the 30 members of that congressional committee last week. And I want to just say a few things. That was, like, to counter the beauty of my trip to China was going to Washington, D.C. And one foreign policy staffer said, after the hearing what I'd learned in China, they said, well, we know better than you because we get briefed by the State Department. To which I went, oh. I said,
no comment.
The State Department that is lying us into war on China, the one that took us to war in Iraq. And the other thing I learned was that in every office, they had an embedded member of the military called the military fellow inside their office, attending all the foreign policy meetings. So war is embedded in your members of Congress's office. I did ask, where was the peace fellow, to which I got chuckles instead of like, let's take this seriously. There's also been a Chinese man arrested in Boston under FARC. I want to remind us that in 9/11, this also happened. They were arresting Muslims under FARC around the Iraq War. And one was this beautiful man who was educating Palestinian children. So we're watching warfare inside the United States targeted. They've closed down all the Confucius schools, which are about beauty and about peace and about connection and diplomacy. So I also just want to share, we just had an EU member, a German parliament member visiting in the US. And I asked her, I'm drifting off into Ukraine for a minute, but I think this is important about the world we live in right now. And I said, don't the elite in Germany, aren't they concerned? Because she was describing that right now, Germany, people were saying that it was like right before World War II. The inflation, the lack of jobs, it's like super scary for people. And so my question is don't even the elite care? And she looked at me like I was crazy and said, the elite in Germany are Americans. The top 30 countries are owned by BlackRock with Americans on the board. 35 bases in Germany, the military is American. The leadership of Germany right now has all been educated in the United States and their friends are in the US. So Germany it feels like it's a vassal state of the United States. So just to say where we are in the world right now, with Ukraine, we are watching a global realignment where the Black and brown people of the world are uniting. Once the sanctions were put on Russia for doing less than what the United States has done in the last 20 years, including killing 1 million Muslims in Iraq and killing 400,000 people in Yemen, the rest of the, people were just like, whoa, this is, if they can sanction Russia, we're all doomed. So there's this realignment happening. So there's a lot happening right now. So the fact that the United States wants to go to war on China is frightening. We did get to see that Blinken was really forced to go to China by, I would say, the elite of the United States and leadership of the world. There's a, slap down right now to Blinken and Biden of like, this is not funny. This is, you're not behaving well. You've got to open up diplomatic channels with China. The people from Taiwan back channeled to the White House and said, you have to stop saying China's going to bomb Taiwan. People know that that's a lie, that China is not going to bomb Chinese people. There would be a revolution. So there's been a bit of a pushback, but I like to celebrate things, but I wouldn't celebrate this because inside the White House, inside the Pentagon, inside the State Department, they want to have a war on China, just like they're having a war on Russia, which, I continue to say is pretty frightening. Mm-hmm. So I just am back from a month in China. And first of all, I just tell everybody to go to China. That's what I return with, that it's very hard. I find it very hard to talk about it because it's so far. The experience in China is so far away from the propaganda that we swim in. China is beautiful. And I was in Beijing, Shanghai, Sanya, which is a city in Hainan, which is the island at the south of the continent. It's the same latitude as Jamaica and very much a Jamaica look and feel. I tend to call it Miami Beach a little bit because there's so many high rises on beautiful beaches. And then I really wanted to go where I could see what happened when they took, where poverty alleviation had happened and where I could talk to people, where I could see what happened. And I wanted to go someplace where it was connected to the Chinese ethnic minorities and also connected to a commitment for the planet and environmental commitment. And so I went to Dali. Dali is up by Burma. It was in 1200 years ago the capital of what is now Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Burma. And actually the small towns that were the capital are still there 1200 years. And a lot of the Buddhist temples and Buddhist structures are there for the last 1200 years. This was a place where the lake was so polluted, it was killing people, it was toxic. And it had been, literally destroyed by farming practices, by tourism that didn't care, by no controls. And so 10 years ago, this was a toxic waste dump, basically, with profound poverty. What I went into, I would say, was, to me, a vibrant peace economy. I worked to cultivate peace economies, and I was in it and experiencing it. And I had an emotional experience that I think changed the structure of my thinking, because I saw what I dreamt of not as a reality. I actually experienced it. And the biggest experience I had was that I've been to 110 countries, to beautiful places where people are there begging, trying to sell you something. There's a need they need you to fill. I was at a place where no one needed anything from me. What they had done was they knew they had created this beauty. It had been created by them. And it's like, that's how China works. It's all local. So here the story was, Beijing sent the money, we created this. And the water had been cleaned up by the plants that were planted in it. And so it's a constant cleanup using the technology of ecology. Everyone's standard of living in the last 10 years had been raised 6 times. I talked to the Bai women there. That's the biggest ethnic minority there. And also the city is created with a respect to their culture. So all the buildings are made in their image of these white buildings with blue trim. It looked a little bit like Greece when I was flying over it. I was like, and what is it like to have your standard of living increased times 6? There's a sense of joy and possibility. And I mean, one day we rode around the 25 miles along the lake. So I was with thousands of the community that day, walking, riding. There were, people on bikes like me. There were people on bicycles built for 2, or somebody riding the bike in front with people sitting in the back, or somebody riding with like 6 people on each side. It was in every way it could be. People were riding along the lake and laughing and celebrating. And I finally got to the smallest of the 1,200-year-old villages, and there were people selling things, but they didn't need me to buy. They were just offering. And that was an experience I hadn't had. Watching their joy all day, and being in it was joyous itself. So to see that level, to be inside of that plan that arose from all these threads coming together to plan together, and that Chi's commitment to what he calls clean waters, lush mountains, to be inside of it and witness it as accomplished was pretty profound. And then the next day, I climbed up to the top of the mountain, which the city is at 8,000 feet, and then the mountain's at 14,000. And they used to be lots of Western mountain climbers would come there. There's a great rock faces, and they have limited everyone being in the nature, the wildness that surrounds the lake. And so you can only go on these specific paths. And so climbing up to the top of the mountain with lots of people, but I love there was about 30 from a company. They were on a company outing for the weekend. And it was a company that transformed trash into energy. And there they were. It's like, I see that a lot in China, where there's a lot of, when you work together, play together. And so it was fun to be in the witness of that. I've seen it before, but I got to see it on this trip. And then also a lot of the people that we would see in the different villages were Chinese tourists from all over the country, who also were blown away by, in the same way I was, by the beauty and the transformation and the nourishment that it was to be in Dali. I saw this commitment to clean waters, lush mountains kind of thought in all the cities, where the streets are clean, the subway is clean, the bathrooms are all clean, the cities are full of parks and full of flowers. And I'm used to Shanghai, which is just full of parks, and they're so beautiful. But when I was in Beijing, what was interesting is like every major road, and I think it was just because it was May, but every major road had more roses than I'd ever seen. Like the central median of the roads were these bushes of roses that just went on forever. And that there's this commitment to beauty that they understand is deeply affecting to human beings. The other thing is speaking to the women. And I spoke to some feminist professors. I wanted to know, what is it like to be a woman, given that some of the women that I had met, they knew their grandmother who had bound feet. So let's just think about like what it would feel like to be alive when you saw your grandmother's bound feet. And here you were, one of them, she runs one of the biggest media projects. It's not a state media project. She created something called Chinese Academy. And what she does is she has professors that come on and talk about different issues, because she was trying to respond to like all the TikTok, kind of simple-minded stuff. And she has 8 million people who come on when this professor talks. So for her, and what she's doing to affect thought and with this some of the professors, it's what it's like for women that I was with that came from Africa and Brazil to be in a country where they felt safe as a woman. And one of the women that's been there a year, she said, I didn't realize how much energy I had to expend to feel safe every day. And I didn't until I'd been here a while and I realized something was missing. And it was that I had all this extra psychic capacity that had been taken up by trying to create safety for myself. So I also want to say that one of the driving forces to get everyone out of poverty was that poverty affects women worse than men. And a lot, what they understood is that men in poverty are much more brutal to their wives than men with a job and means, because it affects their basic sense of identity. And so a driving force to alleviate everyone's poverty was that it was a way to support the women. So, I mean, there's so much to say. I just wanted to give some context before Georgia started asking questions.
Oh, well, now I want to ask so many more questions than I've got written down. But I want to highlight a few things you said, because you were talking about PBS won't show this documentary film that was made about this town in China.
No. It's made about the whole. So how it's a really interesting film, because it's like, how did China take 900 million people out of poverty? Like, you know, clearly had it in it. You actually learn how that happened. It's like they have a structure, and they have, first of all, the last thing they worry about is money. And they don't give people money. They give people the infrastructure to not be in poverty. So that's education and healthcare and housing. It's like all the things we call for, you know, in the United States, but they actually understand it and deliver it. And it's also about not band-aids. It's about creating the capacity, the actual infrastructure that doesn't allow people to be in poverty. And I just also want to say that I kept asking, you know, like I come from Venice, California, where I live with 5,000 unhoused people every day. And I was just like, to be there for a month and not see a single homeless person or poor person, I was just like, aren't there, like, where can I see poverty? And don't you have homeless people? And the answer from like 20 people, because I would ask the same questions, trying to get different points of view, and everybody had the same answer. If people fall through the fabric of society, they're picked up and taken to where it's needed. And I was just like, wow, like that everybody knows that. I mean, the other thing that's really wild is that everywhere you go, there's a phone number. Like if it's a park, if it, you know, like the community place, there's these phone numbers that have like an image on it. And you know, that's the phone number to call the local person to report anything, you know, like toilet paper's out or the plumbing's out in the bathroom. I mean, the public bathrooms, I just want to say the freaking public bathrooms, there's a bathroom everywhere. They're super clean and they're super well cared for. So I got kind of obsessed with public bathrooms, but they all have these phone numbers, just like the parks, of if something's wrong, you can call somebody and right away somebody takes care of it. Oh, another thing I want to tell you, all the folks like from around the world that I was with that were visiting, people lost their phones, somebody lost their passport, everything was returned. And within a day, I mean, in a city like Shanghai and Beijing that are, you know, 50 million people or whatever, that there's that they figure out like how to do this. This one guy from Brazil, he lost his passport and he was needing to travel somewhere, and in 24 hours, and he called the Brazilian embassy and, you know, put them on alert. It was turned in 5 hours. That somebody took the effort even. So yeah, sorry, but I will put it in the chat, how you can learn more about the PBS film, but yes, it has been censored. It is educational. You should watch it. We have
How do we watch it? How do we watch it?
We have it on the Code Pink website that you can watch it.
Great.
I'm not sure I can totally get to that right now.
No, don't worry about it. We'll get it.
I can send it to you. We have access, the producer and the director have sent us the movie that, you know, our folks can watch. They're very grateful that we're raising this up. And like I said, it's a service to Americans to even understand these planning.
Yeah, I want to just throw in something right now, because I know a lot of people, and I don't know that they're on this call, so I'm not referring to anybody on this call, please understand that. But I do know a lot of people who think by watching like MSNBC that they're getting real news. And trying to convince people this is mainstream news, it's censored, you are not getting the whole story ever, is very important for us to tell progressives that this is in no way a progressive news source, nor is it, it's a censored source, basically. And we are operating in this, what is called the Overton window, which there's a level of acceptable discourse. And beyond it, on any side, it's not allowed. So we're only getting the acceptable discourse about China, about Russia, about the military, which is one of the things I wanted to bring up. There are two things I want to bring up with you before we open it up to questions. One is the war economy, because I think this is a critical piece of why we go to war one place after another constantly, and why we're propagandized. First, it's Ukraine, in what I call a proxy war. I'm sure you see it the same way with Russia. And now China is being prepared to be our next enemy.
Well, this is so important, Georgia, because first of all, everybody should know that Ukraine has already been privatized by BlackRock. So that's already happened. And one of the things about China that, you know, the US, even the Civil War, the rich get richer. Billionaires are made on war in Western capitalism. In China, they believe in the win-win. And so they win when there's peace. And that's what, you know, one of the things, here's the really problematic thing. Americans don't understand their own imperialism. Yes, we live in an empire. Yes, it is brutal, but it is also the culture we live in. It is the, you know, it is, as they say, the water we swim in that we can't see. And we have a habit of trying to see other places through our own culture.
Right.
China is not like us at all. And that's, I think, the really difficult part for most people. China doesn't think like the US. Like people in China going, are you crazy? The US is crazy to think that China is going to bomb Chinese people. There would be an uprising of 1,500,000 people. Oh, China, the US is crazy calling Xi a dictator and China an authoritarian government. You cannot have an authoritarian government over 1,500,000 people. It is impossible, especially with police who don't have guns. I mean, the whole concept is crazy. So the fact that you don't understand that there is a 3,000-year-old culture that is based on Confucianism, which is based on care, which is based on a peace economy, which is based on a giving, caring, sharing community model that is not about individualism. It is about care of the community. And that China, like, there's no way people in power know anything about, like, it's like there's too much. It's impossible. It's just the whole concept is like people are crazy. I mean, people in China just look at you like, what in the hell? And so doesn't mean you can't squash protesters. It just means you can't, it's not an authoritarian government. They squash protesters in the United States too.
Oh, absolutely.
They just killed people in Cop City. So let's just be careful. We understand.
Right.
And Tiananmen Square, no one's been killed, including in Hong Kong. Not a single person was killed. So let's just remember that China learns lessons and it learns them well. It is an experiment. It knows it's an experiment. It's a 100-year-long experiment, and it knows it's made lots of mistakes. And it knows other people have made lots of mistakes. And it tries to learn from everyone's mistakes, including its own. So it also is courageous about making mistakes. Mm-hmm. And you know, if there's a problem and they don't know how to answer it, they try 5 different major cities to try to deal with it in 5 different ways. And then they see what works and then they move on with that. But they're experimenting, iterating all the time. That does not happen in the West. We're just stuck in a model that's super old and not working. And
Right.
instead of iterating, we're running it into the ground. Instead of learning lessons, we just keep like hammering down, what did Einstein say, to do the same thing over and over again is insanity. Well, that's kind of where we're at.
That's where we're at. And I think what you're describing is what I would call self-referencing, where we reference everyone else in every other country by the way we are, and they don't operate the way we do. So we have to learn to get out of our little shells that references everything by the way we would do it, both personally and politically in our country, nationally. One thing I wanted to bring up before we open up is Taiwan and this critical place that Taiwan is in. And one of the books we read in our book club was Chip War by Chris Miller. And in there, of course, we learned about how most of the semiconductor manufacturing of the world happens in Taiwan. So Taiwan is a critical piece of real estate in a way. I mean, a lot of both China, the US, and the world really depends on Taiwan. So this is why I think partially it's become kind of a football between China and the US. So
Well, let's just say it's not a football between China and the US.
We've made it that.
Okay, the US started it. Let's, go back to Tibet. China wasn't bothering Tibet, but the US took the CIA and armed Tibetans to go to war on China. And of course, it's going to respond back. So let's look at what's happening with Taiwan. I think the US got worried that they had invested so much in the chips in Taiwan, and it started to make up stories so that it could take weapons to Taiwan, which the Taiwanese people do not want. And so they're looking at Ukraine and going, that is not what they want.
Right.
So, a lot's happening there. What we didn't see is when the weapons came to Taiwan, there were protests at the ports in Taiwan by the Taiwanese. I did an interview with a Taiwan professor. I've done other interviews that you can see them on Code Pink YouTube to talk about the complexity of this issue. But let's just remember the US drives these things and then pretends like, oh, wasn't our hands weren't on it. And so the cool thing is it's been backfiring. So when Nancy Pelosi went, the next month, there was elections and that woman's party lost because the people of Taiwan want peace, not war. And she was playing with war and her party lost. So that was already a pushback. Next, the Taiwanese have back-channeled to the White House and said, you have to stop this because actually contracts are being broken and dropped and not signed by corporations that were going to come into Taiwan because now it's like too scary and they don't want to be there. So it's already affecting Taiwan. And the Taiwanese are fortunately like going, the other thing is Taiwan has been propagandized by the United States for the last 20 years. We've spent a lot of money. So if you talk to people who are from Taiwan that don't live in Taiwan, they have a very different view of being a Taiwanese than a person in Taiwan because they've been getting this whole other story beaten into them from US propaganda. So it's it's super complex. All we want is no war.
Right.
So that's what Taiwan wants, is no war. And Taiwan is China, and Blinken had to come back, from that meeting and say that again and iterate again that the US would not, get in the way of Taiwanese independence, which Taiwan's not fighting, it's not going to do
it.
So it's just the US really created a hornet's nest, which they tend to do. And China has a commitment to peace. US is going to tell you it doesn't, but there's nothing in their behavior that proves otherwise. And also it's China has presented a peace plan to Ukraine and Russia. Right. China just did a peace plan with the Middle East. China wins in peace, which is what the United States probably knows, and they fear it because US wins in war. The US rich get richer when there is disharmony and violence inside the country and disharmony and violence outside the country. That is a core sin of the United States, and we've known that for decades and decades, that the GDP is built on hell.
War.
Well, it's built on all kinds of hell. It's built on divorce. It's built on accidents. It's built on fire. It's built on, anything that goes wrong means the rich can get richer. I'm Naomi Klein, and many others have, said this. So that is not the core economic model of China. It has a core economic model of win-win, and that China wins when everyone wins. China, the under heaven is what the responsibility of leaders are. And if they fail at that, they're kicked out. And so the Chinese government has a commitment to serve the people, and war doesn't serve the people, certainly doesn't serve the people in the United States. In the last 20 years on the war on terror, $22 trillion of US taxpayers has been spent on the war on terror. When you think of the very fabric of the society in the United States, in 20 years, it has been shredded. And even the behavior of the war, the weapons are a solution, that weapons are what you use when you are in an argument, itself is a problem. It's a problem in the very fabric of the society we live in, on the hate that is driven internally as we drive hate externally. And $22 trillion is so much money, it's inconceivable. And that most of that money has gone in the pockets to make billionaires. When the war in Iraq started, or the war in Afghanistan started, the war on terror, from then to now, the counties around DC are now the richest counties in the country. Why? Because they've all profited from war. The amount of money that makes it into a war profiteer's pocket is kind of frightening. And the fact that you're paying money, your taxpayer money, is going to a military person to be embedded into Congress's office so there will be more money for war, is a crime that we're allowing. That is horrific. And these weapons, we just spent trillions of dollars on an F-35 that doesn't even work. And now they want another fighter pilot, another fighter jet, and they want to do another $1 trillion on nuclear weapons we shouldn't even have. Those people are in those offices selling them the package.
This is horrific to realize that they're in those offices. I wanted to make one comment, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. But the number of bases that a country has on foreign soil tells a lot about what their goals are. The US has 800 bases in foreign countries. Russia has less than 30. And you said China has 1. So
yes, but it was clear. One that was, they did that because the US requested it.
Right, okay. That's something that's, it should give people pause to think about what the goals are when you create that many bases, and the countries that don't do it, what the differences are. And we are so propagandized in this country that we constantly, and that's what the Praxis series is about, is to try and overcome the constant barrage of propaganda that we're getting. So I know John has a lot of questions here in the chat box. Do you want
I've been answering them, but John, also, yes, it's propaganda, but I'm not going to speak to it because I call it a weed that's been created by the State Department. And the truth will come out, and I promise you it will come out. And the other thing is, the greatest crime against human rights is war. So it really, there's a very deep story about a win-win that is at the bottom of that. Nothing in that story talks about the 4,000 terrorist attacks by Uyghurs in Xinjiang and what had to happen to stop them, and that it has. And that I was with Uyghurs while I was in China, dancing with them, hearing stories, but I'm not going to share them because that's the weeds, and I don't want to be buzzsawed by talking about it. It's not useful for me. Georgia talked about like the narrowing of what is being allowed to be said. I was in members of Congress's office. They know things. They want to say things. They say they're under their desks because they can't talk about peace. They can't talk about diplomacy. If you should be frightened that where this country is right now about what is not allowed to be talked about. It's scary. And so I am just going to be smart and only talk about why we need peace with China. All the little side stories are laid there, and I call them the weeds, to pull people into the weeds that are not necessary because they don't stop war. They're actually tools for war, and I find tools for war not useful.
Very well put, Jodie. Now I'm going to ask if anyone else have some questions from this group. And if I call on you, you can unmute. Okay, Brian.
Jodie, thank you so much for being with us today. This is so educational and so helpful. So one thing that you mentioned that I never heard before or was not aware of, that there's a military person in every congressional office. Is that so? Is that accurate?
Well, a military fellow. Yeah, I was shocked myself. I was just like, you should have seen my head was spinning, like, no, this can't be true. We have military, they were embedded in war, lying to us from the war zone. Now they're embedded literally in the congressional office.
Every single office.
I don't know every single office. For sure, every office that I went to of these 30 members of that committee.
Oh, I
So
see.
it could just be people who are on foreign affairs, military committees. You know, maybe they're not in an office where a member isn't on a committee that votes on the military.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? Some people don't know how to use the automatic thing, so I'm looking. No, if we don't, I think you've oh, here's Ben. Okay, go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, I'm very happy to hear Jodie here do some counter programming to this. It's apparently a bipartisan rush to China hawkery, and it's sort of taken me by surprise because our elites have established this narrative because we had such a tight and lucrative commercial relationship with China that we were downplaying some of these differences. And I'm concerned because I see the same mechanisms that have led us to war before and that keep us on a war economy footing happening now. And it distresses me that a lot of this is coming from my so-called progressive allies. And the entry point seemed to be the moral outrage developed over people seeing war up close in Ukraine. And so it has animated a part of the population that was not, previously was tended to be part of a peace camp. And so just realizing that, my friends can be, manipulated that way concerns me. But I really think the root of the problem with our national relationship with the PRC is that they're running a better operating system. They spent the last 2 decades building out a 21st century infrastructure. They've spent many trillions of dollars on it. We spent those same 2 decades bombing, destabilizing, and have nothing to show for it. And we're frankly, we're behind in the race for the 21st century. And the lizard brains of the people in power can only think, oh, an enemy, somebody possibly more powerful than us. And it's an asymmetrical battle. I don't think the Chinese want to create a war with us. I think they would like us to stop talking like this. And anything we can do to encourage that is good.
I think you're so right. First of all, yes, the US is feeling very left behind and they're scared. And all they have is weapons. We don't know how to do anything anymore but weapons. That's really all. If there is a war with China, I have to say that I talked to every Westerner I could in Shanghai my last day. And I asked the question, what do you think about this coming war on China from the US? And I love this one French guy's answer. He said, I know you're from the US, but I'm really more worried about the US than China, because the people in China just are like, what? Do they not understand who we are? First of all, this is a country that, got crushed by the West, were humiliated. They fought back. This is a country that hasn't lost. It will fight back to the last person. We've already seen that. They are so committed to this experiment that is working. You all don't understand. I don't know how to get Americans to understand. I mean, the closest I can think is it feels like what life felt like for me in the 70s, you know, where I, as a person coming into the world, had a lot of hope. Things were easy, you know, like the world was my oyster. I really regret that my grandchildren don't have that experience right now as they're coming of age. But in China, the young people have that experience. And you're right. They've spent the last 20 years investing in the infrastructure of their country. So if there's a war between China and the United States, we haven't invested in our country. We count on China for so much. Y'all don't understand like how many corporations are in China that the stock market would crash. There are more like Kentucky Fried Chickens in China and Starbucks in China and more Teslas and Fords and iPhones sold in China. I mean, it's a country of 1,500,000 people and it's affluent. Now, that doesn't mean everyone's affluent, but they do also have a work ethic that comes out of this whole country commitment to thrive, that they're all in it together. And the thing is that workers have been rewarded, that you do work, you know, for your 3 years and you do move up. You are not stuck at the same job for 30 years, ground down to like nothing. You have an optimism because you're moving. I mean, I was just walking down the street with my friend Jeff in Shanghai, and there was a delivery guy driving by. And I was like, these delivery guys look so happy, and they're always like smiling and waving at you, and they have pink cars, and you know, they're kind of super animated and fun. And Jeff said, yeah, every single one of them is going to end up in an apartment in Shanghai. For them, it's just like, this is my 3 years, I got to do this, and then it's the next thing. That there's this possibility, but it's not about becoming a millionaire. It's about creating stability, that there is a value and an understanding that we all thrive when everyone thrives. They actually get that. And we don't get that. We get the competition, you know, push people down, get on top of them, excel. Like everybody wants to be a billionaire or a millionaire. It's like, it's gross. That's just gross. Oh, I just want to say like Chi just did this thing where he said, okay, no, you get arrested if you tutor students. No more tutoring. Why? Because that creates inequality. Because rich people can pay for tutors and poor people can't. He says we can't have inequality. There is an education system that serves everyone. Everyone has to be part of the same education system. No tutoring. Wow. Like, you know, it's like, how do you get to equality means you got to have rules. You got to have, you know, boundaries around things to keep people in them. And so no more tutoring. And that's, oh, and the other thing he said, he was like, shame on you parents. Children need to be children. Stop forcing your children to excel. They need to have their childhood. By the way, his wife is amazing. I'm super in love with Chi's wife. She's a Chinese ethnic minority who's a brilliant singer and just lovely, lovely, lovely. So I just think any guy who can pick her as his wife is smart.
Well, you know, this whole idea of aspiring to be millionaires and billionaires is so American. I mean, when I go to Europe, you don't find this in Europe. I mean, it's just here. And people here think it's everywhere, and it is not. It's a propaganda mechanism that we didn't have in the 70s. I mean, this has all happened since 1980, and Ronald Reagan was president, and Thatcher was head of prime minister in England. This didn't exist here before that. It all has been manufactured in the last 40 years. And I think to understand that is important. I know Brian has his hand up again, but I know we're running out of time. So you tell me, Jodie, do we have time?
I can't. I have 10 minutes before I get back.
Okay, Brian, go ahead.
Good, quick question. So how do we reach friends, neighbors, folks that we know who are brainwashed by the propaganda system and believe that China is the enemy and they are just afraid? How do we connect with them? How do we reason with them? Or somehow?
Yeah, with the Ukraine war.
So first of all, I say this to, you know, on Ukraine and on China, on everything. I said this about Iraq. First of all, the most important thing is that you can only change your friends. So you've got to find enough education that makes you feel what I call as a tuning fork for peace, and share, but not for outcome. We have too many peace activists that share for outcome. And we've got to acknowledge people's fears, how much they've been steeply, like people hold on to things for their literal identity. And we can't judge people about that. We have no idea why they hold on to these stories. But chipping away is just being another story in the room. If you can say it without without an attachment to outcome, I think that's the best way. As a peace activist, I have done that ever since I started to say, go against the Iraq war. I'm in the room. I'm, super unpopular all the time because I'm saying the thing that is different from what everybody believes. But, people all over the world trust me because they remember that 20 years ago, I said this thing that they didn't believe, but then I was right. So it's just like, it's kind of like the thing on, Shenzhen, just on the Uyghurs, just wait, the truth will come out, but you don't need to talk about that. What you do need to talk about is like, why would you want to believe this when it could lead to a war? What is the use of it? Isn't it more beneficial for humanity, for the planet? Please, everyone remember, there's the greatest contributor to climate change is war. If we do not end war, we are over. The numbers prove that. And the thing that just fries my brain is that we know that it's fact, it's been presented, and people just shove it under the rug. If we do not end a war, this planet is over. And what's really sad is those people in Guam who are fighting, trying to stop this US base going into Guam, they just had a horrific tsunami hit them that has just devastated the island. They're on the front line of climate change that is being forced on them by the US military, not acknowledging their sovereignty. As we try to say, we're acknowledging the sovereignty of people in Ukraine. What about the Black and brown people of the world that we have not acknowledged their sovereignty ever? In Latin America, in the Middle East, in these islands. So, find the places where you feel secure in the information, educate yourself, and be a tuning fork for peace. And I say, do it in the most joyful, attached way so that you can just, offer wisdoms into the room, be a tuning fork for peace, because it's not worth fighting. At Code Pink, we say, if you have to get in this, you're a tool of war. So it's like how to be disarming. And maybe it's just like, can I share my view, or would you like to listen to this person from China? We have so much information on our website. I try to do a webinar a lot so that people can just like, why don't you plug into this? Why don't you listen to this person or that person? And what we're trying to do at Code Pink is create a lot more soil that people can, find that is about peace, that different points of view, different people talking. I mean, I created a really big tent when I started this, people that wouldn't be in the room together on the, issues they fought for, but that all believed that the war in China was devastating. And let me say, we have a lot of billionaires and leaders of industry with us because they know this is bad, and they're in the White House telling them this is bad. We've got Bill Perry, we've got Jerry Brown, we've got a lot of people in Biden's and Blinken's ears shame on you. So, I also know that this country does really stupid things and they've killed and murdered a lot of people. So I just sit on that, as Eduardo Galeano says, on that razor's edge of which way can it go. And I just try to be a tuning fork for peace wherever I can go. It's all we can do. It's really all we can do.
And that's why next week's program is probably important, an end to arguing, how to say things in a way that doesn't drive people into this reaction that is that just escalates. So I think that's
and if they react, you don't need to.
right. Yeah, and that's a hard one because we have that tendency to do that if we find a reaction coming at us. So I think what you're saying is really important. And as for resources, I think Code Pink website has a lot of good resources on the Ukraine war. I think Medea Benjamin's book is just right up there among the best. Really good information, factual.
And I'm writing one called China's Not Our Enemy right now, which is great. All the tools that can help everyone in the same way Medea's did for Ukraine. Great. So Georgia, thanks for all you do in your community, all you do for peace. We're just launching a summer of peace at Code Pink because it really is it's become a bad thing to be about peace. So we want people to be bold about peace signs in your window, like all the ways you can just like make peace safe and cool.
Like wear earrings like yours.
Like my earrings, just make it like, just, in subversive ways, let's just have the peace sign happening.
And peace should never be subversive. I mean, it's just unbelievable, really.
All
Jodie,
right.
it's just been fabulous having you here with us today. Thank you so much. Really,
Thank you, Jodie. And I've
Thank
also
you.
posted all of Jodie's links in the chat. Her website, her wiki, her Code Pink's website, Code Pink wiki, all that stuff is in the chat.
And it's just codepink.org/China. You can find lots of resources.
great. So
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. So does anyone have anything they want to say before we close? Oh, I think I'll stop the recording at this point.
Yeah, I'm curious.
Fantastic, Georgia.